As we were planning for tonight, we were trying to guess how many people we would have show up for this, and our ranges were anywhere from 6 to 200. And then when we saw the weather today, we thought, ooh, we're definitely going to be on the low end of that, so I appreciate you coming out on such a beautiful night. I know when I went home to grab a bite to eat, it was difficult for me to come back to convince myself I wanted to sit in this room for a while. So I appreciate you coming in on such a beautiful evening to spend some time with us on this topic. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nancy Ridley, and I'm the city manager for Mount Pleasant. And we have a number of staff people here today, and we have some planning commissioners and city commissioners who are here with us tonight as well, because they wanted to hear your input on the future uses of our Mount Pleasant Center property, because that's what tonight about, is getting some public input on what those future uses should be. As many of you know, the city took ownership of a good portion of that land in 2011. So tonight is about, for some of you who weren't here when that decision was made, maybe giving you a little bit of history about why that purchase decision was made. For those of you who were in the community at that time, maybe it's a reminder for you of why the City Commission made that decision. But for all of you, it's a chance to update you on what's happened in the 5 years since we purchased the land. And as one planning commissioner put it, as we were talking about the planning for tonight, it's kind of like a reset button to make sure everybody knows where we are currently with the site, and then look to the future to get some good input on what we want to do with it as we look to the future. So as I give this overview tonight, I'm not going to do any in-depth on any one item. The presentation's to give you a quick update on a number of issues. And for the sake of brevity, I would ask that you hold your questions to the end, because we're covering a lot of different things in it. So some of the things you may have questions on, it's highly likely we might cover as part of the presentation. So what our plan is for tonight is to give an overview of the site. So you're going to have to listen to me for about 25 minutes or so, but you get to see some videos during part of it, and you get to see some pictures, so it won't be all that boring. And then we're going to actually break into groups, and we're going to disperse you throughout the building in small groups and actually get your input in those small group sessions, because we found it's easier to do that instead of in a group of 40 or how many ever we have here tonight. So as we talk about the history of the site, this first part, I'm going to cover almost 120 years of history in about 30 seconds. And please know that it's not to minimize the importance of the history of the land and its uses. We recognize the history plays a very important role in our community and shapes the community's view of that site. But we could spend multiple hours talking about the history and its implications, and I'm certainly not a good, adequate historian educator on that kind of thing. We have a lot of other resources in our community that can do that much more effectively than I can, both on the Mount Pleasant Center uses and the Michigan Indian Industrial Boarding School uses. So tonight what we're going to do as far as history is just look at the timeline, that a good portion of that land was used from 1893 to 1933 for the Michigan Indian Industrial Boarding School. And then it was turned into the Mount Pleasant Center under various names over the years from about 1938 to 2009. And basically the Mount Pleasant Center operated as a residential care facility for individuals of various needs during the time that it was in operation. The decision to purchase the land by both the city and the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe occurred in 2011, and the city's decision was made after receiving public input and actually having a town hall meeting before the City Commission made their decision. And the City Commission's decision was really based on 5 primary reasons. The first was to control and have orderly growth of the land, because it was a large, most of it undeveloped section of land on the northwest side of our city, and the City Commission wanted to ensure that we had citizen input into the future use and development of the land from the whole city, instead of just individual requests going before the Planning Commission for it, and we wanted our city ordinances to be enforceable. It was also about tax base and job development. The initial purchase price was pretty attractive from the state. We were able to purchase it for $1 plus the out-of-pocket costs of the state, which was about $54,000 at that time. So that was fairly attractive, but we knew that we were taking on some responsibility with the buildings that were there. The decision of the City Commission, though, was really to add taxable value to the city's tax base, hopefully generating long-term revenue and hopefully having the ability to moderate our millage rate over time. It was also felt that the city might be able to assist private sector development through grants, and it was hopeful that redeveloping that site might incent other development along Pickard Street as well. The third reason had to do with the appearance and the maintenance and the security of the site. Although the Mount Pleasant Center officially closed in 2009, there were multiple years leading up to that when its use was being scaled back, as many of you know. And the city began to witness the beginning disrepair of the buildings and the grounds, and it was felt that we might be able to manage that locally a little bit better than relying on a staff member from Lansing, if the state continued to own it, who may not be as concerned about how the property looked. Fourthly, the city had some funds available to help with that redevelopment. We had some money in our Project 2000 fund, which I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes. We knew we could lease some of the land temporarily to farmers to generate revenue to help maintain the site. We knew we could salvage some of the property that would help us with some of the demolition costs. The City Commission knew that we had some bond capacity that would be available in 2017 because we had some bonds that we had issued for the public safety building that would be paid off, so we'd have some capacity available in 17. And then we had some economic development funds available. And quite honestly, the city had been successful before in accomplishing a similar thing. For those of you who have been around for a while, you've heard of Project 2000, which occurred in the late 1980s. And it's the area on the southeast section of the city, and this is kind of a small map that depicts it that you really can't make out very well, but it's between Preston and Broomfield and Crapo to the east side of Isabella. And this was similar in that the city purchased the land, readied it for redevelopment, and then worked with entities to develop it into a mixed-use area with some open space. The original purchase of this land in Project 2000 occurred in the late 1980s, and as you know, there's still some of it that's not fully developed. So the Mount Pleasant Center decision was based on some of that same premises. The City Commission knew it would take multiple decades to fully utilize that land, and it was certainly a long-term decision that was made. So what happened is the state owned the land, so they had to pass a law that gave them the ability to sell it. And so that state law gave both the city an opportunity to purchase part of the land, and it gave the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe an opportunity to purchase the part where the original Indian school buildings were and the cemetery. When the actual transfer took place from the state, the legal description did not include all of the original Indian school buildings, and so in 2012, the city transferred additional land over to the ownership of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe to ensure that they had control over all of the original buildings. The land itself, we always assume people know what it is, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page about what area we're talking about. And it's on the northwest side of the city, obviously. Along the southern boundary is Pickard Street. Along the western boundary is Bamber. The northern boundary is all the way up to River Road, and the eastern boundary is Crawford Road. And it's important to know on the eastern side of it, there's about 13 and a half acres that's owned by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe, which is where the buildings of the original Indian Industrial Boarding School are built. Those are the interesting red brick buildings, is I guess the best way to describe them. On the west side, there's also an acre parcel that's the cemetery that's owned by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. And also on the west side is about 7.5 acres that's owned by the Mount Pleasant Public Schools that has 2 buildings on it. And so within that square, the city owns the rest of the land. And in the middle of it, where the blue area is is where Mission Creek runs through there, and there's some floodplain and some marshy area, which takes up about 15 of the acres. Some of you probably saw the social media post that had an aerial view of the land, but for those of you who did not, we wanted to take a couple minutes just to show a little bit of the aerial so you can have some perspective of how large it is. So I've got about 4 minutes of video that I'm going to show you and point out a couple key pieces of the land. So where we're starting is the cemetery is right over here in this section along Bamber Road. So what this camera is doing is it's starting to turn to head toward the east, and we'll actually turn around to look at Pickard once it gets all the way around. So this first building here is one of the cottages that was used during the Mount Pleasant Center days, and then Pickard Street is down that way. So the camera is going to kind of reset. It takes a second for it to reset so it can reorient itself. But right behind these trees here is the two buildings that are owned by the Mount Pleasant Public Schools, to give you some perspective of where we're at on the land. So we're about halfway through the land looking south. And what the camera is going to do is take you down this road to show you many of the buildings that are owned by the city that are right in the middle of that property. And most of these these first buildings you're going to see are what were known as the cottages, where residents lived when they were at the Mount Pleasant Center. So it's taking you down the road so you can see those, and you can kind of see some of the infrastructure of the roads that is through the middle of the site. Again, Pickard Street is down in this area to give you some perspective. And this is the main road here that comes in off of Pickard and goes back to where these cottages were. And then along here is where you start getting into some of the support buildings. There's a maintenance building along here. There's a laundry facility. There's a kitchen facility. This area was medical offices. And you can start to see in the distance here the red brick buildings. So we're heading east now. And these red brick buildings are the original Michigan Indian Industrial Boarding School buildings that are owned by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. So this road goes right down to there. And the property line between the city and the tribe is right before you get to these red brick buildings. So that kind of gives you an aerial perspective of the south part of the property. So I'm going to exit out of that and then show you a quick picture of the north part. If I can click right here. So the north part, this is the building where we started. This is that cottage that I mentioned, and here's the cemetery area right there. So now we're looking north, and it goes all the way down to River Road. So you can see all the farmland and all the vacant area that's on the north half of the property, and all the wooded area that's over here on the eastern side. So again, we just thought it was interesting for you to have some perspective of the vastness of that as we talk about it. And then we have a couple more current pictures of it. So these are some current pictures of the buildings that are owned by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. These are the original boarding school buildings. These are the two buildings on the western side that are owned by the Mount Pleasant Public Schools. This is the 1-acre cemetery that I mentioned. And then we have a few pictures of the 17 buildings that are owned by the city. Most of these buildings were built in the 1950s and 60s. They're all interconnected by underground tunnels because that's how the utilities were done. And you can start to see some of the disrepair that they continue to be in. This is the old power plant that ran the utilities for the whole center. So that gives you both an aerial view and a picture of some of the current buildings. We have had the buildings that the city owns reviewed by the State Historic Office, and they have confirmed that because of when they were built and how they were built, that there's really no historic significance to the buildings that are owned by the city. And as you're going to hear later, one of the market studies we had done indicated that there likely wasn't any adaptive reuse of the buildings because of the way that they were designed. So we've been focusing our energies over the last 5 years on demolishing most of the buildings that are owned by the city. And the feeling was it needed to be done at some point for the property to be redeveloped. It would likely never get any less expensive to demolish those because many of them have asbestos in them, and you all know the cost of having to deal with the asbestos abatement. Most importantly, we felt we needed to eliminate the attractive nuisance that those buildings have. Even though the property's posted as no trespassing, we all know that people go out there. It's just interesting and people want to see what's going on. So we've had people that have been in the buildings even though they're not in the best repair. And so certainly liability is a concern, but more importantly, we just don't want anybody to be harmed when they're out there. I think all of us would feel really bad if something happened regardless of the whole liability issue. So we feel it's important to get rid of the buildings just from a safety standpoint. As far as what we've done so far with demolition, 2 buildings, the 2 that were right along Pickard Street, were demolished as well as the water tower in 2013 and 2014. At the last City Commission meeting, the City Commission approved a bid to demolish 2 of the back cottages, a couple of the ones you saw in the video, the tunnel that connects them, the 2 small houses on the front section of the property, and to remove a couple of underground storage tanks. So that leaves us with 13 buildings that the city would still own that are standing out there. And when we did the bidding, we asked for bids on those other buildings. And quite honestly, the bids were fairly favorable for the rest of those buildings and the roads and so forth. So we're continuing to evaluate those to determine if we're going to make a recommendation to do some additional demolition yet this year. And that decision will probably be made in the next month. On the archaeology standpoint, the city's been working with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe and CMU on some archaeology issues out at the site. As a matter of fact, CMU has done 2 field schools out there, which have been very informative, and some of those field school work was done on the city-owned land. Those schools have identified some areas that we know need further review and research, and we're continuing to work with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe and CMU on that further review. Where building demolition is occurring, prior pictures and known practices at that time indicate that the land was so very disturbed during construction, but what we've done to be proactive for that is we have what's called a discovery plan that both the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and the State Historic Preservation Officer have had input into. And what that discovery plan says is during demolition, if anything is identified, both the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and the State Historic Preservation Officer are notified immediately to determine what best to do for next steps. During some of the hard surface removal, the roads and so forth, where the ground may not have been disturbed as much, we're looking to have an archaeological monitor on site as we remove those hard surfaces. And then after the demolition is complete, we hope to work with both the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe and CMU collaboratively to look at a plan to identify if there's any other archaeological issues on the site before we move too much more forward. So from an infrastructure standpoint, as the prior picture showed you, it's surrounded by 4 paved roads. The city maintains Pickard Street on the south and Crawford Road on the east side. The county maintains River Road on the north and Bamber Road on the west side. As far as utilities, there's service to the site along the south side on Pickard Street. There's both water, sanitary service, and storm sewer, but just along Pickard Street. The only water other than that is there's a line that goes up Crawford about to Mission Creek Park, but there's no other utilities around the perimeter of the site because the site had its own utility system. It was all interconnected, so there's nothing else around it. The evaluation of the utilities on the site lead us to believe it's probably not usable for future development, and so utilities will need to be added in the future, but nothing's been designed because it's very dependent on how the site ends up being used. From a master plan perspective, the current zoning of the property owned by the city it's actually zoned as agricultural. The future land use, according to our 2014 master plan, has a future land use of redevelopment opportunity area. But we all know that anything we do on the site has to be sensitive to the uses by all the neighboring parcels and the neighboring owners. The master plan outlines 4 goals for when the site is redeveloped, and the 4 goals are to bolster economic growth, to promote a culturally sensitive and responsive design, to integrate accessibility, and to promote best practices of a sustainable design. But you'll notice it doesn't say anything about how it should be zoned. None of those decisions have been made yet. As far as future use, about what we know with the other pieces that are owned in that area, the Michigan Indian Industrial Boarding School Committee is working to determine the future use of the buildings that are owned by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe. We believe that their desire is to preserve those buildings, but a future use, as far as we know, has not been determined yet. The Mount Pleasant Public School buildings, their future use is somewhat dependent on having utilities more readily available. And then the city-owned property, we received some public input on it when the decision was made to purchase the land. We received some when the master plan was done. But that's what tonight is about, is to get some more input into what those future uses should be of the city-owned land. To give you some market perspective, as many of you know, a highest and best use study was done in 2012, just as the economy was starting to turn around. That study confirmed that there was likely no adaptive reuse of the buildings. It recommended that they should be demolished to get more to a greenfield site. It confirmed that anything on that much acreage would likely have a mixture of uses. It wouldn't all be one thing, most likely. And it recommended some type of institutional anchor. And it also recommended further investigation into a food hub on a section of the land. But that food hub required an additional, much more detailed study, which quite frankly was never initiated, because our efforts turned to focusing on identifying funds for demolition and getting the demolition complete first. Based on the market analysis on some potential specific uses for the land, that 2012 study did not recommend any other specific uses, but as we know, the market has changed a bit since then, but as we also know, the market will change a lot over the decades to come. And we have to continue to remind ourselves it was a multi-decade decision. So as the Planning Commission and the City Commission started talking about this over the last couple months, they started talking about, are there any parameters we want to give as we start to obtain public input? And their parameters are pretty wide open. I think there was general agreement by both of those boards that any use of the land would likely have multiple uses, but there was no certainty on what the appropriate allocations of those uses might be. There was general agreement that there's some desire to have some open space preserved as it's developed. They indicated that it's likely not a great place for an industrial setting. They'd be open to that, but their initial thought was that's not likely. But they also recognize that any future plan should be based on weighing both what the public expects and what the market will build there, so to speak. So tonight, as we have you start working on this for us, please know we don't expect you to be market experts, and we don't expect you to be planning experts. But what you are is a great community voice that will give input to both the Planning Commission and the City Commission into your desires of the future use of that land and what you believe best meets the goals of the city to make this community even better than it is today. So a couple of additional pieces of information that the Planning Commission and City Commission thought might be helpful are these two charts. And the one on the left shows you within the city limits, how is our acreage currently being used? What kind of uses do we have out there? And on the left-hand side, that 48%, that represents the number or the percentage of the acreage within the city limits that is non-taxable. The 27% is residential usage, the 22% is commercial usage, and the 3% is industrial usage. So that gives you some perspective just within the city limits of how the land is used. The right-hand chart shows you, of those uses, who generates the tax dollars to help support the city services. And obviously the non-taxable don't generate any dollars, so they're not on the right hand of the chart. But the right hand shows 54% of the revenue from property taxes comes from residential uses, and the other 46% comes from commercial and industrial, both real and personal property. So that gives you some perspective of how the city is currently comprised right now. As far as housing market, we hear a lot of questions about that, and we're participating with a region-wide housing market analysis this fall, which will be available to us. And what that study will tell us is what housing demands there are in our community that aren't currently being met. So unfortunately, you won't have that information as you do your work tonight, but rest assured before any final decisions are made, we'll have that analysis done. So that concludes the overview to get you all reset on the same page to know what's out there. So what we're going to do for the rest of this evening, for about the next hour, is we're going to break you, as I said, into smaller working groups, and we're going to move you into different conference rooms throughout the building. You'll have a staff facilitator in each of your groups, and at your meeting location, you'll have a large map of the site, and you'll have various tools to help you with your work. And the staff facilitators have a number of prompted questions to get you thinking, and other staff and city commissioners will be walking around amongst the groups to kind of observe, hear what you say, and be able to answer any questions if you have them. But our goals for tonight, just to be real clear on what we're looking for from you, is we're looking for you to exchange ideas with each other. That's why we're going into the smaller groups, so it's easier to exchange those ideas. We would hope you'll listen and learn from each other and maybe look at things maybe a bit differently. We're hoping you'll identify some possible parameters for the future use of that almost 300 acres, and all of that will provide input into the Planning Commission and City Commission as they determine next steps for that property. We think it's important to outline a couple critical assumptions that we want to emphasize. A couple of the assumptions we would like you to work under tonight is that all of the city-owned buildings and infrastructure will be removed. And as a matter of fact, the maps that you'll work from won't even show the city buildings on them any longer because we found it's too easy to get focused on that and get distracted. So we photoshopped all of those out of the maps that you'll be working on. We expect that there will be a mixture of uses on the 300 acres. We expect that there will be some open space preserved on the site. The city would prefer to not retain ownership of the majority of the land over the long term. And development, as I've indicated a couple times, may occur over years or even decades, so things could change. It may be necessary to respond to changing market demands. It may be necessary to negotiate with potential purchasers, but most importantly, please know that this will not be your only opportunity for input. We've had input during the purchase decision, we had it during the master plan, obviously we're going to have it tonight, and there will be other opportunities in the future to have public input as well. So after tonight, what will happen is we'll take each of the small group suggestions and we'll prepare a summary document of what each group came up with. And the Planning Commission will receive that summary at their May 5th meeting. The City Commission will receive it at their May 9th meeting. We'll likely post it to our website so anybody who's interested in it can see what the different groups came up with. And we're also more than happy to email it out to any of you who desire to have your own copy of it if you've provided us an email address on your sign-in sheet. But then after that, I have to be honest with you, I don't know what the next steps are after we get your input. So much of it depends on what we hear from you tonight as far as what the next steps are that the Planning Commission and the City Commission will take. So I can't commit to anything after that report until we have some valuable input from you. And then once we see that, then the next steps may become more clear to us. So that's your 25-minute presentation. I think I went almost exactly on time. So what we're going to do is break you into the small groups now, and your staff facilitators will answer any of the questions you have about your assignment if you need them. And I'm going to turn it over to Jacob to have him break you up. Any of you those that don't know him, Jacob Kane is our city planner.